Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Teagasc National Beef Conference 2020. So my name is Conor McAloon. I'll be chairing this evening's meeting. I'm a vet professor in bovine health management in the School of Veterinary Medicine in UCD. So I'd just like to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank Teagasc for the opportunity to be part of this year's conference. So we have some really interesting talks this evening given by two really important and highly respected figures in the industry. So firstly, we'll have Dr. Bernadette Earley from Teagasc, who will talk about some of her work on space allowance and underfoot conditions in indoor finishing cattle and performance and welfare. And then we'll have Dr. Doreen Corridan from Munster Bovine, who will talk about best practice vaccination protocols for sucklers pre-calving. So before we start with our first presentation, just to mention that each presentation will probably take around about 20 minutes. We'll have a short Q&A session at the end. And so what we'll do is we'll we'll hold questions to that point. But as you're going through the presentations, if you want to type in questions in the Q&A box, we have people working behind the scenes to collect these, and then we'll talk them through and discuss them at the end of both of the sessions. So as we said, our first talk will be given by Dr. Bernadette Earley. So Bernie is employed as a Principal Research Officer in the Animal and Bioscience Research Department in Teagasc in Grange and County Meath. Dr. Earley's research in the area of bovine immunology, animal health and welfare, and animal behaviour is documented by more than 160 publications in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Earley has established a network of collaborators in Ireland, across Europe and internationally, and she has characterised and published research findings on aspects of animal health and animal welfare related to disbudding, castration, weaning, housing and transport, and her research has been foreign policy at national, EU and OIE level. So I think if Bertie is there, she'll kick us off for the evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Conor. I'll just load up the presentation. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to my presentation this evening. I'm speaking to you from Teagasc Grange and County Meath. As Conor mentioned, my talk is on space allowance and underfoot conditions for indoor finishing cattle. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge some of the collaborators on this research with me. Dr. Mark McGee, Dr. Eddie O'Riordan and Dr. Ellen Kelly at UCD, and our PhD Walsh scholar, Kathy McEtigan. So really to set the scene for you and why we're addressing those important areas that we see certain issues are facing the beef industry. And these are concerns that are coming from EU and UK retailers, and they're mainly concerning the welfare of beef cattle on concrete slatted floors. If you see the abbreviation throughout my presentation, CSF, it will refer to concrete slatted floors. There are also issues raised by the EU and international health and welfare advisory bodies, and those would mainly be bodies like the European Food Safety Authority. There was a scientific committee, Animal Health and Animal Welfare report, which was published back in 2001, and that also had recommendations, as well as the international body which is governing health and welfare is now part of its remit, and that's the OIE. Some of the suggestions or recommendations are that to increase the space allowance for finishing animals, to phase out the use of concrete slatted floors, and as an alternative to those, to provide perhaps a solid lying area with bedding or slats covered with rubber mats. And just to point out as well that at present there is no EU regulation yet concerning finishing animals. So this is something that's going to come down the line in the next while, is an EU regulation on this aspect of the beef production systems. So to set about how do we address this then, so we set about doing a number of studies, and just to point out at the start, all of our studies go through ethical approval before we can commence any study. And we also have to receive individual authorization ourselves, as well as project licenses to carry out the research. The research I'm presenting you today is published already in the journal. The scientific paper is published in the journal Animal. This particular study I will describe to you, so I will go through some details with you. So we had 240 late maturing continental crossbred beef heifers, and they were assigned to one of 4 treatments. So we selected the treatment of 3 meters squared, which would be considered close to the standard recommendation for animals. We looked at an intermediate space allowance of 4.5 meters squared, and then a more generous space allowance of 6 meters squared on slats. So those 3 treatments were on concrete slatted floors. The recommendation of 6 meters squared is what is being proposed. As a comparison, we looked at 6 meters squared in a straw bed, and those were our 4 treatments. We weighed, dirt scored, and blood sampled the animals every 21 days. All 4 hooves of each animal were examined at the start and the end of the study, and we recorded animal behaviour using CCTV recordings. Carcass measurements was also collected post-slaughter. So this slide just shows you the experimental timeline. So with our 4 treatments, we had 24 pens, and we had 6 pens per treatment. And the pen in this case represents the experimental unit, not the animal. So we have a total of 240 animals on study. So on day -2 and day -1, before we commenced, we weighed the animals, and then we assigned them to treatment on day 0. So we collect blood samples to look at immune variables to see are there any changes in the stress responses. We dirt scored the animals, assessed the hooves to see was there any presence of lesions on them, and then animals were assigned. So then every 21 days we weighed, we blood sampled, and we dirt scored the animals. On day 104, just the day before the animals were slaughtered, again we weighed them, collected a blood sample, and dirt scored them. And the animals were then slaughtered on day 105. Again, they were weighed. We looked to see, we recovered the hooves post-slaughter and looked to see was there presence of lesions and what number of lesions would have accumulated over the 105-day period. And then we collected the carcass trait measurements as well. Within each pen, we had CCTV cameras positioned, and those cameras were recording the behaviour continuously. I should also point out to you that this particular study, we carried it out at Keepag in Clonee. The reason being is that we needed a facility which would accommodate 240 animals. So to achieve the space allowances that we required, the 3 is represented there in green, the 4.5 in orange, the 6 meters squared in blue, and the straw treatment is represented in yellow. It was necessary to make some modifications to the pen in the facility. So you will see there what we call randomizing animals or pens to treatment. You'll see that within the shed itself, the floor types are randomly assigned throughout. So that would represent our 24 pens. The feed face, you might ask, was it the same length? It was 4.5 meters long, and it was standard for each pen. So what I will show you now is just some photographs of the animals at 3 meters squared on the concrete slatted floors. You can see that the space there is quite generous as well. At 4.5 meters squared, a little more, you can see more generous space. The animals have more than adequate space. And at the 6 meters squared on concrete slatted floors, you can notice here, and it's just an observation, and it's usually found with studies of this type, you'll always notice that animals will lie very close together. So even though the animals had quite generous space on the floor, they tended to lie together. Also, you'll notice that on the concrete slats itself, there's more accumulation of fecal matter, and this is really because the animals aren't threading through that fecal material through the slats. Our space allowance then of 6 meters squared on straw, to achieve this, we used unchopped barley straw, and this was placed over a membrane. The membrane allowed the passage or the movement of water as well as urine through it onto the concrete. The membrane was placed over the concrete slat, and on top of that was the barley straw. This was replenished at a rate of 150 kg per pen every 3 days. The recommended straw allowance for animals, an animal per day, is 5 kg. And within our systems here, or within Ireland, we would not be able to produce that amount of straw if we had to bed animals at 5 kg per day, but we can come back to that later. In those pens, the straw was fully removed and it was replaced every 2 weeks. We never allowed the bed to rise any higher than 25 centimetres. And the membrane itself, it was placed, as I said, over the slats, but we also brought it up to a height of about 0.5 metre all around. And this was to prevent the movement of the straw into the adjacent pens. Now, to show you some of the results here, we have our 3, 4.5 and 6 metre squared on slats. And we find that there was no difference in dry matter intake. The initial weight is represented there. The slaughter weight, no change in slaughter weight. We did find that animals at 4.5 metres squared, they had a better average daily gain than the animals at the 3 and the 6. And this, we also found the same with the feed conversion ratio. However, you'll note there that the carcass weight, there was no difference across the 3 treatments, so that was not significant. Kill out percentage was similar, as well as carcass conformation score, no change in carcass fat score or hide weight. So the other comparison then within this study was to look at the concrete slatted floors at 6 metres squared, compare that with the straw at 6 metres squared. Again, slightly heavier slaughter weight represented there was significant. Average daily gain was greater with the animals on the straw. Feed conversion ratio also better. However, there was only a numerical increase in carcass weight, and this did not achieve statistical significance. There was no difference in kill out percent, carcass conformation score, or carcass fat score. But what we did find was the hides, when we collected them post-slaughter of the animals, were heavier on the straw compared with the 6 metres squared on the slats. So in this particular slide, I just want to show you here, or describe to you when we talk about dirt scoring animals. So the body part is essentially divided into 16, and each part is assigned a score of 1 to 5. So 1 is clean and 5 is dirty. So every 21 days, I mentioned that we dirt score the animals. So here you can see our 3 treatments on the slats, the 3, the 4.5 and the 6, and there was no difference in dirt scores across those. However, we did notice that even though we managed the straw bed very well, there was an increase in dirtiness in the animals on the straw compared with the 6 metres squared on the slats. The other welfare variables that I mentioned was there was no difference in the number of hoof lesions at the end of the study, and also in the blood immune variables across the treatments. Lying time was not different either across the 3 space allowances on the concrete slats. However, we did find that animals lay down for 1 hour longer on the straw bed compared with the concrete slatted floor. So then, just the conclusions that we drew from that particular study was, if we look at space allowance, increasing space allowance above 3 metres squared, it had no effect on animal intake or carcass weight. The animal welfare was not affected by space allowance. When we look at floor type, then we can conclude that heifers on the straw, they had an improved ADG with no effect on carcass weight. The heifers were dirtier on the straw than those on the slats by the day of slaughter, and the lying time was increased by 1 hour on straw bedding. So where does that leave us then? So what we have, the next approach then we have taken is, well, what does the international scientific literature say in relation to space allowance? So to address this question, we carried out a meta-analysis of all the published literature. And this was really to look to see what differences are there in performance and welfare variables of cattle housed at different space allowance on concrete slatted floors. So what I've represented here on the left are the average daily gain, the feed conversion ratio, carcass weight, lying time, and dirt scores. And animals that are housed at a space allowance less than 2 meters squared, you can see that there is a negative impact, negative effect on all of those variables. So housing animals here would be detrimental for their welfare and performance. If we then look at the comparison, this is data again published in the literature. And I should mention as well that we've published this paper in 2018 in Livestock Science. Again, if we compare 2 to 3 meters squared on slats with greater than 3 meters squared, again, there was no significant difference by increasing the space allowance for animals. However, we did notice the data in the literature showed that the animals were slightly dirtier here at the 2 to 3 meters squared. So the next question then we asked, well, what does the international scientific literature say in relation to underfoot conditions? And here we looked at, again, the same variables, average daily gain, feed conversion ratio, carcass weight, lying time, and dirt scores. And the data suggests that there's no significant difference when you compare concrete slatted floors with straw bedded floors. And to the right there, you can see the number of studies that was included. So then we followed on further and we said, well, what does the international scientific literature say? Again, if we look at concrete slatted floors with concrete slatted floors covered with rubber mats. Again, we've looked at the same variables, average daily gain, feed conversion ratio, carcass weight, lying time, and dirt scores. And within those comparisons and those studies and the represented, there's no significant benefit coming through. So most of the scientific literature is quite conclusive. However, you could say that when you look at rubber mats as such, they don't actually mention a particular type of mat, it's more generic rubber mat. So bearing this in mind, we set about doing a further study where we looked at the effect of floor type, again, concrete slatted floors versus rubber mats overlaid on the concrete slats. And this is a study which is carried out by our PhD Walsh scholar, Kathy McGettigan, with us at Teagasc Grange. We presented the first data from this study on the performance data in BSAS meeting earlier this year. So with this study, we had 144 late maturing continental crossbred beef steers. The study was carried out at Teagasc Grange. The animals were adapted to diet for 21 days before assigning to treatment. The diet was grass silage to a rolled barley-based total mixed ration on a 60-40 dry matter basis. The animals were blocked by age and weight and assigned to treatment. So we had concrete slatted floors, we had 18 pens, concrete slatted floors covered, and the mat we used, the particular mat, was a Durapack rubber mat. We had 18 pens. The study duration was 120 days. Again, the experimental unit was the pen. The space allowance per animal was 3 meters squared. We had 4 animals per pen, and the pens were balanced across treatment and in the shed, and the initial weight was 597 kg. Feed was weighed into each pen daily, and refusals were collected twice weekly. In addition, the animals were weighed every 14 days from about day 0 up to day 84, 85, and then during the finishing period, they were weighed on a weekly basis. Carcass weight, conformation and fat score was collected. Additional measurements which we're working through were dirt scores and blood immune variables, and those variables were collected every 28 days. Hoof measurements were made as well at the start and at the end of the study, and animal behaviour CCTV recordings. For the presentation today, I'm just presenting to you the performance data. So the pen layout as we had in the shed facility is like so. So we had concrete slats is represented by the blue colour. The rubber covered mat or rubber covered slats are represented by red. So again, we had randomization of the treatments throughout the shed. And then this is just a photograph showing some of the animals in the pens and the experimental setup. So when we look at the data or the results from this study, again, we find that there was no significant difference in dry matter intake. We did find that there was a benefit in terms of average daily gain, and this difference was about 170 grams per kg per day. Again, if we're looking at the feed conversion ratio, you can see there that there was a beneficial effect there, that the animals on the rubber mats were performing or more efficient than the ones on the slats. When we look then at the slaughter weight or the carcass traits, carcass characteristics and kill out percentage, in terms of slaughter weight, we find an 18 kg advantage. In terms of carcass weight, this amounted to 11 kg. There was no difference then in kill out percentage, carcass conformation score or carcass fat score. So with that in mind, we concluded under the conditions of this study that performance and feed efficiency of finishing steers was enhanced on rubber mats compared to concrete slats. Just also to mention that we carried out a study as well on suckler beef weanlings last winter. The animals were on concrete slats and also on the same rubber mat, and we didn't find any change in performance with the suckler beef weanlings over a 120-day period. So with that, I suppose I have presented some of our scientific evidence to you on space allowance and floor type. The information is there to inform policy at national or at EU level. And as well, just to say that I suppose in Ireland, we're unique in our systems, our finishing systems. We would consider ourselves quite short in terms of duration, maybe 4 to 5 months compared with some systems on the continent. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Bernie. Very interesting presentations, and we have a couple of questions come in there already, so there's been a bit of interest in that, obviously. We'll hold those to the end, though, and we'll pass on to Doreen now for her presentation, if that's okay. So Doreen Corridan graduated from UCD with MVB in 1987. She got her PhD in reproduction in 1990. She works with Munster Bovine, who supply the suckler herd with genetics and breeding advice in the Munster area. So Doreen and her husband Tim and daughter Katie run a suckler herd of pedigree Limousin cattle. Doreen enjoys suckler farming and is very passionate about its development. So thanks very much, Doreen.
Am I sharing, Conor? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, thank you for inviting me to speak here tonight. So what I'm speaking about is best practice vaccination protocol for suckler cows pre-calving, and I was asked to keep it reasonably practical. So I suppose the first question we ask ourselves is what do we need to achieve, right? And if we look at our key performance indicators, one thing that we can clearly see is that we need to shorten down the calving interval. We need more calves per cow per year. We need to keep cows longer, increase the average number of calvings. We need to calve more heifers earlier and try and cull less cows and have less cows recycled. And at the end of the day, what we want is an extra weanling in every load, or an extra animal going to the slaughter in every load. And we also need heavier animals. And so this will lead to more profitability, more production. And it'll also lead to suckling actually be more enjoyable. Now, so why vaccinate? And I think as suckler farmers here in Ireland, we're extremely lucky with the amount of very good vaccines we have available. What vaccines do is they prevent disease. And they prevent disease spreading from one animal to another. And also, if an animal is infected, by vaccinating them, they'll actually shed less. Also, vaccinated animals are easier to cure if they actually do succumb to the disease. Animals reach their potential. And what you see in farms that vaccinate, they have less unproductive animals around the place. Management is easier because you all know during the spring and the winter, you work extremely hard, but there's nothing worse than having sick animals around the place. Vaccination will reduce your labor. It'll really give you peace of mind. And very important, what's getting very important now, we'll have less antibiotic usage, right? And it'll also make suckling more enjoyable. So there are several reasons, to vaccinate from the point of view of preventing diseases, less labor, more peace of mind, more productive animals, and less antibiotic usage. Now, we're often asked the question, what should I vaccinate for? And I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, what problems had you on the farm for the last 12 to 18 months? Had you scouring calves after being born? Had you pneumonia in calves after being born? Did you lose a couple of calves with blackleg? Ask yourself those questions. Another very useful thing to do, and it's very cost effective, is at the back end of the year, when your weanlings are weaned, prior to sale, take bloods, depending on herd size, from 5 to 10 of them, and do them from the different groups. So we'll say do 5 from the autumn group, do 5 from the spring group. Because one thing about sucklers, the calves are actually quite unique in the sense that they're with the mothers for the last 7 to 10 months. So any disease that's circulating within the herd, the weanlings will actually pick it up and they will show us antibodies to it. While blooding the cows, it may tell us what was there now, but it also may tell us what was there 10 or 15 years ago. So that blood sample from 5 to 10 weanlings, depending on herd size, do some from the autumn and do some from the spring. And it also depends on whether you have a closed herd or whether you're actually purchasing in cattle. Then on this slide as well, I showed the most recent information from the regional labs, which are weanlings that were brought in for post-mortem between 6 to 12 months of age. Respiratory infections, number 1. Gut, number 2. Number 3 then is Clostridial. And if we looked at that for calves under a month of age from the regional labs, we'd still have respiratory number 1, we'd have gut number 2, and we'd have navel up there then, navel infections, and we'd have Clostridial. So that is really what's actually shown up in the regional labs. And which is quite similar to what you were seeing in your farms. Now, vaccines do work. However, they are not a correction for poor housing or poor management. And we have a lot of experts out there saying in pubs and marts and various other things, the issues they've had with vaccines, right? But at the end of the day, they do work if they're actually used correctly. However, we actually do need good housing because if you take a house there, the month of November and it's all fogged up with poor inlets and poor outlets, vaccines are really going to be challenged in that. If you take these couple of Belgian blue calves, there's quite a good draft going into those. And then if you take these couple of weanlings here, they're about 3 or 4 blocks high with hairy bellies. So they obviously didn't get enough milk as calves. When they were rare, their mothers didn't enough milk for them. They probably got some hoos. So vaccines will challenge in that. Well, if you look there on the calves there, they're in a good dry bed. They have hay, they have creep, and their mothers have enough milk. So the big thing with vaccines, they do work. And we have access to an awful lot of very good vaccines. However, they're not a correction for poor housing or poor management. So we need to correct other factors around vaccines in housing and management to make sure the actual vaccines work for us. Now, so I spoke to a number of vets from a number of suckler areas to know what is the most important vaccines they see for suckler cows pre-calving. And every one of them said the scour vaccine is absolutely number 1, way ahead of everything else. Because this is a calf here just newly born. And what we basically want that calf to do is get up, suck, get in enough immunity, and not succumb, to scour and pneumonia. Second, probably for suckler cows, would be the lepto vaccine, because as herd owners, we need to protect ourselves. And lepto is something we can actually get from cows. And then we have IBR and salmonella if it's an issue on the farm. And still, it's not, we needn't forget about BVD. There's still a number of PIs out there. And then the suckler calves, for pneumonia as they actually get older. Now, so we start first with the scour vaccine. And we basically have two main vaccines there for scour. We have the Rotavac Corona vaccine from MSD, and then we have the Bovigen from Virbac. Both of them are single shot vaccines. You give them 3 to 12 weeks pre-calving. So essentially, if you take, we're now the first week of December, so if you vaccinate cows now, they'll be covered from calving from late December up to the end of February. Then you can split the cows into two and do the second batch of them the first week of February, and that'll cover them from calving from the end of February to the end of April. So basically, if your calving is spread between late December and the end of April, what you would basically do is do the batch that's calving up to the end of February now, and then the batch that's calving from the end of February to the end of April, do them the first week of February. So it's 3 to 12 weeks pre-calving. And the important thing is make sure it's in 3 weeks pre-calving. Try and vaccinate cows in batches. And a lot of those suckler cows, they can be in quite good body condition scored at the moment. So you would want to use a long needle, 1.5-inch needle, because the vaccine is intramuscular. The other thing about this vaccine, it's a heavy oil vaccine, so make sure you don't inject yourself. It's one of these vaccines where make sure the animals are restrained and don't take a chance. But a very, very good vaccine, the scour vaccine. Now, however, for this scour vaccine to work, what this scour vaccine does is it boosts the amount of antibodies in the beastins or in the colostrum. So the important thing is that the calf gets the colostrum. However, we also want good quality colostrum. And in suckler cows, the number one thing for colostrum is make sure we have good livers. Because if we haven't good livers, vaccinations will not work. Because we do need a liver, to be able to make the animal, help the animal to get a good immune response. So the first thing is, and a lot of you with the BEEP scheme have taken dung samples at the moment for liver fluke. You may miss liver fluke eggs sometimes in dung samples. So if you got a negative, I would consider repeating it. Also look at the factory data. It's very, very accurate, the factory data, what's coming back in your fluke there from AHI. But crucial, correct fluke, because vaccines need a healthy liver to actually work. Second thing with suckler cows is get your silage tested to make sure there's adequate energy and protein in it, especially pre-calving, and also get it tested for minerals. Because it's very easy and very cheap for 6 weeks pre-calving to dust the minerals and the silage. And the most important thing for good quality beastins is feed the cows fully, especially in the last 2 weeks pre-calving. As a lot of suckler cows, especially herd owners with shapy cows like the blue here, have a habit of starving cows in the last 3 to 4 weeks before calving. That's one way of ensuring that the cows will have no beastins. Fully feed them in the last 2 weeks before calving, because the cow can actually not get in enough, the last 2 weeks before calving. And if your silage is low in protein or low in energy, half a kilo soya, talk to your vet, talk to your nutritionist, get that correct. So it's fluke, get the minerals right, get in enough protein, and make sure the cow is fully fed in the last 2 weeks. Then the other thing is the hygiene of the cow pre-calving and the hygiene of the pen at calving, right? And if you have cows and slats and they're quite dirty, the most important thing to do is a week or 2 weeks pre-calving, put them over and put them in a straw bed, so at least they'll dry up and the dung will actually harden in them, right? And try and calf the cow inside in a clean straw bed. Firstly, from the navel point of view, but also to make sure the calf gets clean colostrum. Because the calf absorbs the colostrum in the first 2 to 6 hours after being born. The gut absorbs, really, really good at absorption at that stage. But the gut is not selective in what it absorbs. It'll absorb the antibodies from the beastins, but it'll also absorb any bacteria and stuff we put in there with dung. So we have to make sure in the first 6 hours, the feed the calf gets is actually clean. So try and get those cows clean pre-calving, right? So when you bring them over and when you're vaccinating them, get a clippers, so I mean, with the sheep head in it, and clip the tails, right? And dry up that dung before they actually calve, as the hygiene of the cow is absolutely crucial. Because if we've given the vaccine, we need to make sure there's good quality beastins with the antibodies in it, and then make sure it gets into the calf clean. This is James Alexander here. Some of you may know him. He's a great breeder there of shapy cattle there in the north. And that's a picture of him there in his monkey suit, giving beastins to calves. So he obviously thinks it's quite important with the beastins. And with calves, try and get in the 1, 2, 3 rule like AHI, the first milking of the cow, 3 litres if you can at all, and try and get it in the first 2 hours. So if you have a lazy calf, or if you had a difficult calving, or you came on and you found a cold calf in a pen, so I mean, milk the cow, right, and tube that calf. And you often find after tubing him, then he'll wad him up and he'll suck himself anyway. You can keep the beastins in the fridge for 24 to 36 hours. Just be careful of iones if you're feeding it from a different cow. Freezer, it'll last 12 months, but make sure it's clean beastins you freeze, and freeze it straight away. And we'll see there the bucket with quite a lot of bacteria floating on top of it. So I mean, that is of no benefit to you. So I mean, if you're getting clean beastins from a dairy herd, so I mean, make sure it's absolutely clean. So the big thing with the scour vaccine, 3 to 12 weeks before calving, make sure you have good quality beastins in the cow from the point of view of make sure that she's done for liver fluke. If she has liver fluke, make sure she's adequately fed in the last 2 weeks. Make sure your silage has enough energy and enough protein. If it hasn't, you can easily supplement it with soybean meal and the pre-calving mineral for 6 weeks. And that vaccine will absolutely work wonderful. You'll get immunity into the calves, right? And everything will work well. And a lot of investigations has been done into issues with navels on farm can be traced back to actually to poor immunity. Now, the other vaccine that's probably worth doing for suckler herds is lepto, because you can get it yourself. And a lot of herd owners, do I mean, dealing with sucklers, do I mean, elderly people and so forth. So at calving, try and wear gloves. Lepto, there are 2 vaccines there, Leptobite H from MSD and Spirovac from Zoetis. And they're quite cheap vaccines, I mean, relatively speaking, right? And it's 2 ml subcut, 4 to 6 weeks apart, and an annual booster. And it is important, I mean, for your own health. The other vaccine that's there that works quite well is IBR. And it's a very easy vaccine, I mean, to administer. You can give it to calves intramuscular once they're over 3 months. There's your Bovilis IBR from MSD, there's Risperdal from Zoetis, and Hipra also have a live IBR vaccine. So it's Bovilis IBR live every 6 months then. Or if it's Risperdal, you can give live initially, and then within 6 months inactivate it and give it annually. However, if IBR has been diagnosed as an issue in your calves, give the booster every year, a month before calving. So if you're doing your Bovilis every 6 months and your cows were calving from January on, so I mean, what you basically do is you go in June, July, and then you go again in December. Because if you get it in a month before calving, the antibodies and the beastins for that calves, and it'll help those calves. Salmonella, if it's an issue on the farm, there's a very good vaccine on the market, Bovivac S, controls salmonella, gets the colostral antibodies there, easy enough vaccine to use, 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, an annual booster. Some herd owners use it to control abortion, if there's abortion on farm. So you do vaccinate the cows after weaning. or some herd owners, they get scour in the calves after being born. So what you basically do with that then is boost the cows 3 to 4 weeks pre-calving. And like all vaccines, try and avoid other vaccines within 2 weeks of using them. Now for young calves, once they're born, what we have available to us now is quite a few good intranasal vaccines that can be given very early on in life, in the sense that you have Risperdal there, intranasal, you have Bovilis intranasal, and there's a Bovalto Respi intranasal. And these intranasal vaccines can be given from the first week to the first 10 days of life. And for herd owners who are struggling with pneumonia in autumn-born calves, if they have the housing corrected, I mean, these vaccines work quite well. And they can be followed on then at a later stage with either Bovipast RSP or Bovalto. They're injectable, again, PI3 RSV, but they also contain Pastorella. Right. If you're given intranasal vaccines, use the intranasal gun. So I mean, it's an automatic gun. So I mean, and they work extremely well because you can see there, so I mean, the mist that's out of the vaccine as opposed to using an ordinary syringe with it. However, if you're vaccinating calves, lock away the dams from the calves when you're actually vaccinating, because I mean, some cows can be very, very protective of that. Now, also remember the bull, the vasectomized bull, and especially the young bull when you're actually carrying out herd vaccination programs, because often the mature bull is adjusted to the farm, he's adjusted nutritionally, he's worked out his work rate, and he's been exposed to whatever is on the farm. But it's the young bull, like the Charlie here on the left, that's coming into the farm, extremely well-fed bull, probably over fat. He's going to suffer some nutritional stress, and he may be very fertile and producing very good semen before he comes on the farm, and then he gets exposed to some virus like PI3 or lepto or salmonella, and what we end up with is a bull running a temperature, so I mean, and actually going infertile. So always remember the bull or the vasectomized bull when you're actually vaccinating the cows. We shouldn't forget Clostridial vaccines, because every year in the regional lab, so I mean, we have issues with Clostridial disease, but if you're using Clostridial vaccines, the two main ones on the market is Trivovax 10 from MSD and Covaxin 10. Make sure it's the 10s you purchase, because they contain the 10 strains of the actual Clostridial. Now, generally for vaccines, the most important thing is to purchase the correct pack size. So if I had 25 calves to be done twice, so I mean, purchased either a pack of 25, 2 packs of 25 rather than 1 pack of 50. So you do not have unused vials left over in the fridge. Always check the expiry date before you use it. Keep refrigerated underused until you use the vaccine. Make sure it's not a fridge that was chucked out of the house because it was freezing. So a good fridge, probably the door in the fridge is the safest place to store it, and they need to be stored between 3 and 8 degrees. Read the label. The biggest issue with vaccines is compliance with the primary and the booster dose. If we are to give 2 doses under the skin 3 weeks apart, we need to do that. And then with the booster annually, we need to do that. Work out, is it into the muscle or under the skin? Automatic syringes, absolutely super, right? Do not use disinfectant, so I mean, to clean them, because it'll interfere with some of the vaccines. Do not mix vaccines in the same bottle. So I mean, except there are very few of them that are authorized for that. Allow 14 days between vaccines. Try and vaccinate on a dry day where the cow skin is dry and we can actually be quite hygienic. Discard leftovers. And how we avoid leftovers is buy the correct pack size day one. And also try and avoid stressing the animals around vaccination. As one practice that's often practiced is, will they harden them and vaccinate them the same day? That is not a good practice. Try and have your respiratory vaccine gone into them. So I mean, at least a good 7 to 10 days before you actually deharden them. So try and avoid dehardening and vaccination in the same day, getting the vaccination first. And also to help with the vaccination, so I mean, give some pain relief at the time of dehardening. Now, and again, we're back, it's the extra wheeling in every load. Now, the other thing vaccine do is they reduce disease, so they reduce our need for actually antibiotics. As antimicrobial resistance, AMR, we need to tackle it. It's all our responsibility to tackle that. And by using vaccines, we're reducing the amount of antibiotics we use. And all the antibiotics up here, like the Batrils, the Mycotils, the Cobactins, the Marbicils, the Tylosyns, the Draxins, all those are familiar names to us. However, they're all the highest priority critical antibiotics that we should not be using as a first line of treatment, as we need to protect these as much as possible for human use and only use these when nothing else will actually work. So vaccines have a huge role to play in AMR to ensure that we reduce the amount of antibiotics we use. Because the more we use antibiotics in our farm, the greater the chance we have of building resistance, and the greater the chance we have of actually the antibiotic not working for us. So the more we use them, the faster we're actually going to lose their effectiveness on farm. Right, so with COVID, there's a lot of lessons, you know what I mean, because we've been basically listening to infectious diseases for close to 12 months now. So the first thing is hygiene, you know what I mean, continually washing our hands. And straw, you know what I mean, around the calf and the young animal is crucial. Sanitation, you know what I mean, to sanitize houses. So I mean, crucial. Social distancing, we've seen with respiratory diseases, how easy they actually spread. So stocking rate, you know what I mean, inside the houses. Ventilation is key. So I mean, we stay outdoors, so try and mimic that indoor. Get our inlets right, get our outlets right. Test and trace. I mean, use diagnostics. Who are the positives? What have we got? What are the vulnerable in the population do we need to protect? Isolate the positive animals. And then we're all looking for a COVID vaccine to be able to resume normal life. We have these vaccines there at the moment for the sucklers. So there's a lot of lessons from the COVID, you know what I mean, that fit quite well into infectious diseases and sucklers as well. So I'm finished, so enjoy your suckling, and I hope you found that quite useful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doreen. It was a brilliant talk. And again, a lot of questions in for both talks actually there, so a lot of interest in both. So I'll ask Bernie to come back on, and we have a few questions coming through, so they've been created in the background. A few questions, and I'll start off with a couple of questions on Bernie's talk, if that's okay. So Bernie, one of the questions here is, do cattle lie down for longer per day on mats versus cattle slats or on a straw bed? So this person has a Hereford and Angus heifers being fattened on mats on a straw bed. Which system is best for the finishing cattle?
Well, from our data, we didn't find any difference in lying time on the rubber mats compared with the slats. The study I presented there showed that animals lay for 1 hour longer on the straw bed compared with the slats. But I have to say there that the space allowance for the straw bedded system was 6 meters squared.
Okay. And one question here was around the timing of the experiment. So question here, were the experiments performed in summer? Would there be a difference if they were repeated in winter with colder slats, for example?
Well, actually, they were all performed during the indoor winter finishing period. Always as part of our studies, we record the temperatures in the shed as well as the outdoor temperature. So we have that data as well. Generally, we've never gone very low in temperatures like with the winter time. That would vary very much on the continent. If you think of Italy and Germany, where there are feedlots as well that are using slats.
Okay, and just one clarification here was around the question is, are mats really only beneficial in finishing systems?
Well, from that study I presented there, based on that, we found a benefit there with that particular mat. As I said as well, when we looked at the suckler beef weanlings, the growing animals, we found no difference in performance with animals housed on rubber mats versus concrete slats. Now, maybe it's something that's more particular to the finishing animal that we were able to pick up that benefit.
Okay, and one last question I have here is is there any recommendations on space allowances or research done for a slatted feeding area with a straw bedded lieback for finishing animals?
Not so much research as such, but there would be some recommendations. I would perhaps maybe refer to the SI guidelines from the department. There are some good recommendations there just on the construction. But in terms of research, no, it's quite limited actually in that area.
Great. Okay, I think there might be a few more coming in as we go through these as well, Bernie. So we'll ask you to keep in, and if you have any, I know you've done some vaccines as well. So if you have any insights there as well, that'd be good to add. So Doreen, then a few questions on your presentation as well. One question was, do you think scar vaccine is as relevant in autumn calving herds, those calving outside in July to September, for example?
It all depends, but usually in autumn calving herds, they have much less infectious scour. They just get a bit of nutritional scour due to the cold from being outside. So if a herd owner had no issues with it the previous year, do you know what I mean, and calving outside, do you know what I mean, there is, do you know what I mean, I wouldn't do it. And also it is more relevant inside, calving inside. But I'd also take into account is how compact the calving is and how much labour is available and what's the quality of housing, because we may not have a problem, but the important thing is to prevent a problem.
Okay. One other question here, how close to calving can cows be dosed for fluke?
I suppose the big problem with fluke, it depends on what product you're actually using. Because we'll say if you take the triclabendazoles like the Tribex or the Fascinex or those, cows would nearly want to be inside, do you know what I mean, for 3 weeks, do you know what I mean, before they're actually dosed. While if you take the Trodax, the nitroxanil, of course we can't get it this year, cows would nearly want to be in, do you know what I mean, 6 to 8 weeks, right? And then with Zanil, that, do you know what I mean, that really only hits the mature fluke, do you know what I mean, which is up to 12 weeks. So the important thing is try and dose them ahead of calving, because firstly it's easier, you have a batch of cows there, you'll have more time, and also you won't have to separate out cows from calves, and you'll ensure they'll all be done. Also take into account how long is the cows inside for the product you're actually using. I'd probably avoid using dosing, do you know what I mean, in the week cows actually calf. I mean, because I mean it's just stressing them unnecessary. And then if you're using something like Zanil, you could end up with quite a bit of scour and so forth that we don't need, because hygiene around time of calving is key.
Interesting one here. What about choline for suckler cow in terms of maintaining a healthy liver and helping with colostrum quality? So choline is a sort of a nutritional supplement. Have you come across that, or any thoughts or recommendations on it?
I wouldn't be familiar with it.
I don't think there's much on it in suckler cows anyway in terms of the literature, but interesting one there. One here that came up a few times actually was around, brought-in weanlings where there's not really a good history of the animal. Would you have any thoughts on the sort of the vaccination and dosing regime for those animals?
The big thing, I suppose, with brought-in weanlings is the easiest thing to do with vaccines is assume that they've nothing gotten. You know what I mean? And if you're buying in a lot of weanlings and so forth, one thing I would go with straight away would be the intranasals. You know what I mean? Because they do the PI3 and the RSP, and you get an immune response quite quickly. You know what I mean? Within about, you know what I mean, 5 to 10 days. So you'd be going with, we'll say, Bovilis PI3 RSV, or you'd be going with the Risperdal or the Bovalto, the intranasals. And the big thing with the intranasals is to use the intranasal gun when you're actually giving them. I mean, that's the absolutely crucial thing. And then subsequent to that, I'd probably follow up in a couple of weeks with the injectables, either the Bovipast or the Bovalto Resp3, so I mean, to get into Pastorella. With the dosing, you will have time when you buy them, unless they're coughing, so I mean, to actually take dung samples and see what they actually need to be done for.
Yeah. Few questions come up, another one that come up a couple of times, and it's something you did address and give a sort of a recommendation around it, but I suppose just to maybe ask it again and see if you had any thoughts around it. Was it the idea of giving more than one vaccine on the same day? So I mean, just from a practical point of view, you know, is that something you would definitely avoid, or is it something you would just try and avoid it as best you can? What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I try and avoid it as best I could. So I mean, because there are very few vaccines, so I mean, that can be given, so I mean, together. Because what we basically want to do is when we give a vaccine, we want an animal to get an actual immune response. So we give vaccines as much as possible to healthy animals, trying to be as compliant as possible with the amount, with the route, and to try and get the primary correct, and to do all the animals in the farm or in that group, you know what I mean, on the one day. So I try and stay as much as possible, you know what I mean, 2 weeks between them. But then there are some vaccines, you know what I mean, that are licensed to be together, like, you know what I mean, the Bovilis IBR and the BVD. But I go with the manufacturer's recommendations.
Great, yeah. One other question that came up there was, and again, another really interesting one was, if you had a situation where someone has been farming for and has never had any issues, and you know is wondering, has never vaccinated, you know, how would you? What are your thoughts on that sort of situation?
First, it's a lucky man or lucky woman if they never had any issues. So I'd say fair dues to them. So I mean, the management must be very good. The housing, so I mean, must be very good, and the nutrition must be very good. So what I basically do with those, Conor, is in their weanlings when they're weaned and the maternal antibody is gone from the system, take bloods from 5 to 10 weanlings, depending on the herd size. So many from the autumn group, so many from the spring group, because the unique thing about the sucklers is the calf is with the cow. So I mean, for the previous 7 to 10 months. So anything that's currently circulating in the herd, we'll pick it up in the blood sample in that young animals, and that will tell you very quickly what's going on in the herd.
Great. Yeah.
But that lucky man, I tell him not to buy in anything anyway.
Very good. Yeah. No. So just a couple more questions. One was around. So you mentioned a little bit about sort of vaccination of weanlings. What about timing in that sort of in terms of the vaccination of those weanlings that are bought in? Have you any thoughts on that in terms of timing of those vaccines?
Ideally, Conor, if you could buy them on the land, and the guy you're buying them from, I mean, to vaccinate in his farm before they come to your farm, so that they have immunity built up. Because as soon as they come to your farm, I mean, they're going to be stressed. Right. So ideally, on the farm you bought them from. But when I bring them home, and if I hadn't the opportunity to vaccinate them on the farm I bought them from, I'd be going in straight away with the intranasal. Okay. Try and let them outdoor if you could, and if you couldn't let them outdoor when you buy them, try and put them into big, well-bedded, so I mean, straw shed with plenty of barrier space, so I mean, plenty feed space, and I'd give them creep, so I mean, every day for the first, so I mean, 2 weeks, to make sure they're all eating every day. I mean, and close observation 2 or 3 times a day.
Great. So we've had in the meantime, when we were asking those questions, we've had a whole raft of additional questions in. So you aren't getting away that. One question was around the use of CTC powder being put into suckler weaning feed, and how effective is it at preventing pneumonia?
Okay, I think we should stay completely away from it. Because with the CTC powder, the first thing, it's an oral antibiotic, right? And if we're looking at trying to prevent antimicrobial resistance, we should be completely getting away from oral antibiotics. The second thing is that any of us that have fed weanlings will know it's very difficult to ensure they're all eating the same amount. And it's the sicker animal that probably won't go to the feed, that needs the CTC, that actually will not end up with it. So, I mean, so I try and completely stay away from CTC, and I think it really has no place, I mean, in weanlings at the moment. And the better option from it is it's chlortetracycline, is the oxytetracycline injamycin. So, I mean, you can give the 24-hour dose or the 48-hour dose, far more effective, and you're just giving it to the animal that actually needs it. And if you look at the way the legislation is changing, antibiotics are not going to be available to us for prevention. Do you know what I mean? Down the road, they'll just purely be available for treatment.
Good. Question here for Bernie. Would rubber mats improve the longevity of suckler cows over concrete slats?
It's hard to know. There was some studies like done, which is going back a few years now, where they showed that suckler cows on mats were able to express estrus-like or mounting behaviour in that more so than on the concrete slats. But in terms of any other type of study using them, that hasn't been done yet, you know.
Okay, yeah. And so another question here is about any plans to follow on the rubber mat trial to compare different slat mat brands, or is that something you would sort of stay away from?
I suppose the particular one we looked at was, it had a different type of substrate as such. So that was why we selected that particular one, and it did show some benefit in previous studies. But in the study I presented there tonight to you, it was a well-powered study with 18 pens per treatment. So it was, you know, it had good statistical power to pick up differences.
How would you know, I think for Doreen, how would you know if blackleg is an issue on a farm?
One thing you'll clearly see if blackleg is on a farm, you'll actually have sudden deaths. Do you know what I mean? And all sudden deaths, I mean, should be investigated. Do you know what I mean? Get out your local vet to do PM. And it's quite an accurate PM, do you know what I mean, to identify the blackleg.
Okay, yeah, so I think we're just on a little bit of time pressure, so we'll start wrapping up and after the last, just one question each here for both of you. Bernie, did you find a lot less hurts and foot problems on rubber compared to slats?
Absolutely no difference in heart problems, let's say. But what we did find was that there was an increase in the number of lesions on all of the mats that we looked at before on the hooves. So that was why we collected the hooves, you know, at the start of the study, and then when the studies were finished, we collected them post-slaughter. So we examined them for, you know, white line, digital dermatitis, you know, using the standard scoring pathology system. And all of the animals on rubber mats had an increase in the number of lesions. Animals on outwintering pads had also. So this is really due to the, you know, the conditions where the hooves are, and that bacteria can get into little cracks and start to form lesions. However, I have to say that there was no lameness on the animals, you know, and those studies went for about 150 days, the duration of them. So that was one, I suppose, welfare concern as such, that there was an increase in the number of lesions. So what some farmers do is they'll remove animals off the rubber mats and put them onto a concrete slat, so that you'll get more abrasion of the hoof, so that it'll harden up and it won't be as soft.
And I think we're under a bit of time pressure, so we'll go with the last question then to Doreen, which is around the best way to deal with an issue with crypto.
Oh yeah, crypto is a big issue on farms, and probably it's the more traffic you put through a house, the more crypto you're going to get. So probably if crypto was a problem last year, the big thing to do at the moment is to really get into that calf house. I mean, power wash it out perfectly clean. I mean, the calving pins and where those calves are actually going to be held, get into all the crevices and use some of those quite good products, I mean, that are actually very effective, I mean, at crypto. Right, so it's all about hygiene, 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 right? And then, I mean, the helicure, I mean, at birth for the first 14 days, I mean, when there is an issue, but the most important thing is hygiene and clean out those houses and get them disinfected. And then if you could try and get a break in the calving, I mean, and in the calving boxes, is to clean them out and try and let them rest for the day if you can, but that's not possible. And disinfect them again with those disinfectants that are really good for the actual crypto.
Great. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. We've kind of round to the end of our time, unfortunately. Just a reminder to everyone that the conference ends with a final session tomorrow evening. That session will look at grass-fed beef and Ireland's potential to exploit that market, and will be chaired by Professor Jerry Boyle, who's the director of Teagasc. It'll also feature talks from Dr. Eddie O'Riordan, Dr. Ian Maloney from Teagasc, as well as Padraig Brennan from Board BA. So we'll look forward to seeing you all there tomorrow evening. So just on behalf of everyone, I'd love to thank Doreen and Bernie for both of their talks. Really, really interesting. Lots of good questions and a really good discussion there as well. So again, thanks for all the attendees, again, for all your questions and for your attention tonight. So best of luck and good night to everyone.
Good night and thank you.
Good night. Thank you.